Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live everywhere.
Welcome to another fun-filled installment of the Winter Latina Show, where we discuss terrible things in politics and international relations. It's been a couple weeks. I've regained my voice.
With a little bit of very salty humor.
Just a little tad, because of course we are the Winter Latina Show, so we have to channel the real or imagined Latinness. Is that even a word? I don't know. I just made it up. So on today's episode, we will discuss the anniversary. It's actually kind of unbelievable that we've reached the 10th anniversary of resistance in the breakaway republics in Donbass, Donetsk, and Lugansk. This is one of those topics that I've been watching in real time. In fact, it's one of the reasons, probably the main reason why I stuck around X. Back then it was just Twitter, because when you first register on that platform, it sounds like you're screaming into nothingness, unlike other social media where people actually respond to you, and you kind of are, you're trying to figure out, how do I even get some contact from the outside world, right? And it was because I started covering the war in Donbass that started in April 2014. Again, it's kind of remarkable that it's been a decade that I actually started getting some traction. And back in the day, there was no Telegram, there was no convenient way to go on your smartphone, go on 200 channels that are covering this conflict, download all the little videos, post them, and you're all of a sudden getting all this traction. It was of course, obviously social media existed, but you kind of had to go search for things on Facebook, on Twitter itself. You had to go on sort of local city level websites for information. So this is something, I don't consider myself a journalist, but I would say in that period I was engaging in what could be considered sort of this citizen journalist type thing, in terms of at least trying to acquire information, because of course there was a big discrepancy between what the Western media was reporting, but it wasn't as big as the discrepancy that's happened since 2022. And we're actually I'll read you a blurb from an article to show you the difference between then and now. But before we get into that, I do want to sort of harness my Latina-ness, my Latinness, as a Slavo-Kritvelian woman, and address one little technical issue. I've seen a couple of you mentioning the fact that I'm not using an amazing microphone. And yes, I am using, a thing that's meant to be for phone calls. I do have one of those, the big headphones with the little microphone attachment, which makes me look like a call center operator. I don't like how that looks. So I'm not, you don't have this thing sticking out, and that makes it look a little bit, I'm not a fan of the look. Probably has a little bit of better sound. Now, when I listen back to my recordings, I'm not using a prelapsarian laptop, so that might be your problem. I sound fine. Now, of course, I know that this is a cheap thing. This is not an impressive microphone. It would be very nice to have a sound booth, to have a whole bunch of equipment, $2 million, so I can stop working almost 7 days a week, sleeping 4 hours a night, which is super healthy for us. And I can focus on this. But right now, that's not the case. So let's kind of try to activate the brain cells. Why would someone not blow several $100s on a microphone when they know their sound quality would improve? What could the possible reason be for that? Is it working? Is there movement in there? Well, maybe someone has other priorities where they have to spend money on other necessities, not wants, rather needs, and this is where their money is going. So in my case, I don't like to talk about my personal life, but I'll give you one example of many. My best friend, my dog of 12 years, died last week. So I'm still in mourning. I'm devastated, and my dog has had cancer. So I had to take care of him for 3 months after his diagnosis. One vet visit was $300, another vet visit was $500, another vet visit was $1,200. Those things actually add up, believe it or not, in addition to all the other things that you have to do to take care of your family, of yourself, of your home, of very, very basic necessities. So guess what I chose to spend money on? Was it the Winter Latina show, which is, as much as I enjoy this is a fun project that's not making me any money right now? Or would I spend money on taking care of my dying dog? Yeah, it's my dog, but congratulations, he is dead now. So I no longer have that expense, and I will consider saving money for a better microphone. Now, what you can do, there's a couple of views. One is you can just leave, not skin off my back, and go listen to someone with a better microphone. Number two, you can simply get patient until I'm in a position to not get like a crappy $50 microphone, but actually invest in a nice piece of equipment. Or number three, I actually don't push this here, but I do have a Buy Me a Coffee, which is like Patreon. You can go, it's linked on my profile. You can go make a little donation and say, this is for your microphone. And I would appreciate that. I would actually prefer number one, where you simply don't listen to me, because I find it really unempathetic. And I think it's really obvious where the reason someone is not getting a sound booth or a microphone that's expensive is because they are not in a position to do this because they have other things that are going on. To me, that's really obvious. But maybe if you're super rich, or mommy and daddy are taking care of you, maybe that's not the first thing in your mind. Okay, now that I've channeled my inner Latina-ness and I've addressed this question, we can get into the topic of Donbass rebellion. And yes,
but
go ahead.
Before getting into the topic, don't forget, all the links of the Nina and our channels. So our channel right now don't have a Patreon or anything like that, but you can always give a thumbs up, share, subscribe with your friends, and show, oh, this is so cool. See, there's some guy talking to some girl somewhere. This is very nice.
They're so multipolar.
So multipolar. And also our channel is monetized. So if you want to give a super chat, a super like, a super thanks or something, you can do it by here. And to Nina, the links, also in my channel, the links for Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal, if I'm not mistaken also.
No, I just use Buy Me a Coffee. That's the only one I use.
Just Buy Me a Coffee. All the links are down on the description. Also the link for the website of Nina and to her channel in YouTube and to her channel on X, Twitter X. So you can follow us basically mostly everywhere. And also our links for the ImprensaDeDestruiçãoEmMassa, the media of mass destruction, are all in the description of our video in the Imprensa of Destruição.Massa. It's hard to say a Portuguese word,
Definitely.
a Portuguese sentence when I'm talking in English, but there we go. So today we're going to talk about, this 10 years of Donbass. So you wanted to start with this?
I actually wanted to start with a blurb from the most trusted name in the news, CNN. And the reason I wanted to read the introduction or the first couple of paragraphs to this article, it's from June 3rd, 2014. So it's just about going on 10 years, because I wanted to show you the difference between media coverage since 2022, since Russia sort of escalated a conflict through the, what it calls the special military operation, versus the very beginning of the conflict. Now, remember, obviously, the official West backed the what, in my opinion, is regime change in Ukraine in 2014, what they still call the revolution of dignity, which is a really interesting euphemism considering all that's transpired. But so they're certainly in no way pro-Russian, right? And they're in this article, they're using terms like pro-Russian separatists, pro-Russian rebels, etc. So they do have that kind of a bias. They're not calling them freedom fighters as they would be when they cover or they have covered other conflicts where this sort of the official West backed that type of insurgency. Nonetheless, I think it's very telling to see the language in this article. So I'm going to read it the intro right now. Quote, blood-stained pavement, a woman's compact, a pair of shattered spectacles, a single shoe covered in dust were among the debris left by a devastating series of explosions that hit the headquarters of the pro-Russian separatists in the eastern Ukrainian city of Lugansk on Monday. The carnage was sudden, unexpected. This was the middle of a city, a building adjacent to a leafy square where civilians walked and worked. 8 people were killed, 5 women and 3 men, according to the self-declared Lugansk People's Republic. The authorities in Kiev reported the same tally, but there the agreement ends. The pro-Russian leadership of the city immediately accused the Ukrainian Air Force of carrying out the attack. A fighter jet had been flying overhead at the time, and social media video appeared to show it firing cannon or rockets. The authorities in Kiev denied its planes had been involved. Initially, the anti-terrorist operation said the explosion originated from inside the building, then that an anti-aircraft missile operated by the separatists had misfired, reacting to heat from an air conditioning system on the outside of the building. But a CNN investigation in Lugansk has found clear evidence that whatever detonations, hit the building and the adjoining park came from the air. The tops of trees were splintered, and a series of small craters, about a dozen, had been blasted in a straight line, starting in the park and reaching the walls of the building, blowing out many of its windows and spraying the area with jagged shrapnel. That's what appears to have killed most of the victims and injured 20 more. The pattern of the craters clearly indicated some sort of strafing, according to a munitions expert at the scene with CNN. Their size suggested 30-millimeter ordnance, he said, which is standard equipment on the Su-25, a ground attack fighter, and the Su-27, both combat aircraft operated by Ukraine. So, what is your take from this coverage? Now, like I said, we see terms like pro-Russian separatists, pro-Russian government, et cetera, but what do you find interesting about this?
Well, just in the first paragraph is very interesting the way they picture this, which is, they create an ambiance, they create an imaginary environment of chaos and destruction. So this is not journalism,
right?
To start with. Okay, this is storytelling, if you like, and
Sure.
I've been seeing this very constantly, where I'm seeing this journalists talking about conflicts that it's not in their interest to picture a nice picture or to picture a bad picture of their friends and
But the
quotes, or their
interesting
proxies.
thing here is that they're not talking about destruction in a city that's controlled by Ukraine, by Kiev. They're talking about this devastation in a city that's controlled by pro-Russian separatists. Nonetheless, they're pulling on emotional strings to show you the extent of the devastation, and their team is actually on site. So, we've since then, I don't think they had a lot of teams in that region. I mean, it took a little while. So the team was physically present there. So that's the first thing. What else do you note about this piece?
Well, yeah, there's always this, when they have to picture something that they do not want to picture, there's always these terms that, like, for example, here in the first. So they start by calling the pro-Russian separatists. So it's not free fighters, as you said. It's not,
Sure.
And then they go by the second paragraph where they say the carnage was sudden and unexpected. This was the middle of the city, a building adjacent, blah, 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 lives. The civilian walked or worked. 8 people were killed. 5 women, blah, blah, blah. According to the self-declared Luhansk People's Republic.
Sure.
The authorities of Kiev reported the same tally. So they have to push that this is the self-declared Luhansk People's Republic
Of course.
authorities, and then they have to give the legitimacy
Yeah,
of
quote
the
unquote.
Kiev, or in some other moments here they put the opposite. They use, while the Kiev denies this. Okay, so it's very important that Kiev denies, but then they have people on site, people
Well,
on the
that's
ground.
the interesting part,
for
is that they
investigative.
actually had their own investigation, and they're basically debunking Kiev's statement. They're looking at the patterns from the shooting that came from the air, and they're telling you it's consistent with the types of airplanes that Kiev is in possession of, right? So to me, that is really, despite all the language of, self-declared, blah, 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 they're not freedom fighters, they're separatists, elsewhere they would say rebels. The fact that they're still essentially debunking what the Kiev claim is that we didn't do anything. They, the air conditioner exploded, which, by the way, became a meme. They've made these in that year, and I guess I would say in the probably like 2014 to 2016, there were so many claims by Kiev about exploding air conditioners that it became a meme. It became this really sort of, gallows humor type meme that, oh yeah, another air conditioner exploded, which is of course when in 2022, when there were similar circumstances in cities that are controlled by Kiev, right? Some very dark humored people would also kind of bring up, hey, remember the exploding air conditioners? I guess they're now in the Ukrainian. This is happening on the Ukrainian side too. So yeah, this was kind of one of those things that became a meme, which is, like, how can you even claim that? But the fact that they're essentially debunking what Kiev did, and they're placing blame that is likely, they're not saying it 100%, but it's very likely that Kiev lied and that they shut up this essentially civilian area in a park, a residential neighborhood. I mean, it says a lot. So you have a lot of these quote unquote gems of Western media coverage where you can really uncover the nightmare that Kiev unleashed with Western backing from Western media sources. I mean, it's really kind of remarkable compared to much, much, much more sanitized propaganda coming from Western media sources starting from February 2022 onward. So I find those very, very telling. Now, if we go into, and I'll read those blurbs a little bit later, but we can also look at the coverage coming from various human rights organizations, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. Again, cannot be accused of being pro-Russian, anything but they really, really have very, very telling coverage from that period as well. But before we get into that, let's go back to the beginning. We discussed this topic before. We touched upon it. We fully covered it. So this is not sort of the first time we're talking about it. But we can go to the Maidan, right? So we can sort of look at the timeline of why we're sort of going back to April 2014 as the sort of the official start of resistance in the Donbass Republic. Do you remember anything from the time, or were you not interested in international relations from that standpoint, or looking at maybe alternative media?
So back in the time, I was, of course, living in Brazil still, and there was probably zero media coverage about this. Okay,
Sure.
so basically, I started to have some notion about it. It was a moment when I moved to Europe, and then it was the moment where Russia invaded Crimea. Okay, so then all that started to spill on the news here in Europe for me, and it was always Russia is invading Crimea, Russia is taking Crimea, Russia blah blah blah, all that. So I never cared that much about that because it was not my problem. As I said many times here in the channel, I wasn't supposed to, be worried about that. It's not my problem. I have my own problems, and my country have my own problems. Yeah, and people have their everyday life. They have to, go to work, pay the bills. take care of family, take care of friends, go on vacation, things like that. So I was not too much worried about that. But back at that time, in about 2015, then I met a Russian friend of mine, nowadays a Russian friend of mine, and we start talking about that. So what's going on there? So I was never too polluted by the media.
I see. Sure.
First of all, I was living in a French-speaking country, and I didn't speak French, so I was not watching the news every day.
Right.
Plus, I was not in Brazilian media. That was, irrelevant. It was never too portrayed in any Brazilian media. So I was very away from the news, and at the same time, I was hearing from my friend the history of the facts. Okay, so this is what's happening. This has what's been happening. Blah blah blah, and then time passed until 2022, where the things became, the
okay,
big
so it was
news.
Quite a long time period for you. Okay.
So during this period, my knowledge and hearing about the situation was almost zero. Sure. I was hearing much more about Syria, for example, than about Crimea. I knew something when
right. Obviously, the
there.
Syrian situation also predated in terms of it sort of heating up, right, quote unquote. So yeah, I mean, it's not surprising, and Libya predated it too. So you probably were tuned into those sort of bigger news stories. Although of course the Maidan in the in NATO land, the official West was covered. It was impossible to avoid. And so, yeah, so we have February 2014. I guess you weren't tuned into that at all, right?
Not at all. I have a very interesting question here from Peter Shan. And if you would like, the question is, why resistance in Donbass could last for 10 years, but not Kharkiv or Odessa? I find this question interesting. That's one question I have myself as well.
Well, you can go to Wikipedia, and as biased as Wikipedia is, if you go to an article that's called 2014 Pro-Russian Unrest in Ukraine, you can read exactly what happened in Kiev, in Odessa, in Kharkiv. Well, I mean, there was a little bit of that Kiev, obviously, that got crushed with the Maidan, but in sort of the southeastern, then Ukraine. And according to this Wikipedia article, which I have in front of me, it talks about sort of the cooperation between local civil authorities and the local population to essentially, they're not using the word crush the rebellion, but basically this is what happened. So yeah, even if you look at Wikipedia, which is incredibly biased, and the sources that they're linking to, they're talking about sending in the armed forces to quell the unrest in a very sort of sanitized language to explain what actually happened. But yeah, let's get into this topic. So let's go back. So the Maidan has been going on since the late fall of 2013. This is not the first attempt to sort of unilaterally turn Ukraine toward the official West. We had the Orange Revolution in 2004. It was sort of partially successful, certainly in terms of launching these long-term West-backed NGOs and creating the civil society, again, quote unquote, to sort of foster this environment of we're slowly going to sort of maybe not ban the Russian language, but we're going to move in that direction. We're going to again, not allow Ukraine to be the sort of in-between country that is independent, that can have relations both with the European Union and Russia because of the historic ties. We're just going to turn it around. We talked about Brzezinski's, the Grand Chessboard, where his famous quote is about separating Ukraine from Russia to essentially, make Russia into a non-entity as far as sort of global international politics go, maybe like a small regional power. So Ukraine has been, very openly at the center of that, the Ukrainian territory. So we're in 2014. So this unrest is sort of going on. Of course, whenever you have that type of mass scale unrest, there are some legitimate reasons for people to be protesting, to not be happy with the government. But of course, you can find that in any country, right? Even in countries that are, generally economically fairly sound, you can always find someone who disagrees in some shape or form. And of course, in the case of Ukraine, there was a sort of certain elements. Some of them were legitimately disagreeing. Others were coming from this NGO garden that has been planted, starting from the 90s, but especially since the Orange Revolution. And then things escalate in February, right? In February 2014, things turn violent. And since then, we've had, you mentioned this one investigation that you've seen where it's a European investigation, right? That shows
it's an Italian TV documentary.
That shows that snipers were shooting not from government-controlled areas, but from Maidan-controlled areas. You had this court ruling in the past few months in Kiev itself, right, that also concluded much the same, which is, kind of shocking to even have that kind of a ruling. So now, 10 years on, we sort of have the confirmation. Well, we kind of had confirmations coming from, like you're saying, this type of documentary, but we kind of have it on a higher official level that the things that really escalated the violence did not come from Yanukovych's, right, the then president, his side. It was coming from the side that was controlled by the protesters, and then the types of people that were involved in the shooting. That's very, very interesting, right? It could be people who are just basically hired to do this. Some people may have had their ideological reasons for doing this, but be that as it may, there was sort of the first shedding of blood. Whenever you have this in a mass scale protest, right, there's this massive escalation. And I remember watching this, and I remember watching some people that you knew on social media or you thought you knew that were getting very excited about harming of people who are not supporting the Maidan. Like, they're very excited about the violence, like the police officers that were lost their eyes, right? That essentially had their eyes taken out, right? Sounds incredibly brutal. They're very excited about that. So you were kind of also not just watching this political drama unfold in a place to which, your family may have historic connections, or, everyone in Russia has some connection to that region, right? Because it's because of the common roots. But you were also watching people that you thought you knew, maybe not in person, maybe on social media, in both cases, who are getting very, very excited about the violence, and the violence that was being perpetrated against not just the police, but also the civilian protesters that were not supporting the Maidan. So that was very shocking, I think, for anyone. I think maybe when people, let's say people from the Middle East were watching the Syrian situation happen, they may have had similar feelings of like, oh my gosh, turns out that I don't know him, her at all. When they have such, primal, beastly urges about just physically harming people who disagree with them politically. I mean, it was very shocking. So yeah, go ahead.
And I think that's very important because, sometimes I get a lot of questions from people like, why do you do this type of shows? Like this, I'm supposedly doing my channel, I'm talking to Brazilian people. Why should I be doing a show with a Russian living in the United States talking about Eurasia? And that's the point. Right there is the point, because what you just described is something that has been happening in Brazil also for the last 30 years, and recently we saw a big demonstration of power, of soft power in Brazil. I don't know if you've seen the big manifestation in Brazil with former President Bolsonaro, entering the stage with the Israel flag, and then, doing the military, whatever it's called, continence to the United States flag. And that's the point. That's why I do this. That's why in our channel, we do this with people like you, with people like Kevar Kalmassian, that we had the conversation the other day, people like Kauza, and everybody that comes to the channel. It's to explain to the people of Brazil that, hey, that's not new. And that's how it works everywhere.
It can
Learn about
escalate
it
very, very quickly. I mean, just
very
seeing this,
easily.
that famous quote about the thin layer of civilization, like you were seeing it in people you thought you knew. Just that very primal excitement about violence. And, I can totally relate to the idea of really despising your political opponents, because there's some issues that are, a red line. I'm on one side of the barricades, you're on the other. But when people are just getting very excited about these horrific acts, especially against other protesters who disagree with you, who are not even the police, and they're just absolutely praising this, that was kind of the first wake-up call, even for people who think, for me, I thought I was sort of somewhat politically educated. I am here studying, history at this extensive level. I feel like I am, fairly intelligent. And then you see this and it just completely, well, of course, it makes you understand certain historical events too, how quickly things can escalate from, you have this nice, orderly, civilized society, then bam, all hell breaks loose, and how quickly that could happen, right? Obviously, it's a huge word of warning. But yeah, it was a very shocking situation for I think a lot of people personally to see that happen. But yeah, basically, the Maidan was a success, right? There was a lot of money pumped into making it a success, coming from
and cookies. Don't forget the cookies.
And cookies, yes, absolutely. That was sort of the key catalyst, was the cookies for the Maidan to be a success. And yes, so last week of February, right, the Yanukovych's government is toppled. He flees to Rostov, right, which then creates a lot of jokes about him. And, even though in the West he's always been portrayed as this like pro-Russian guy, I don't really think he's ever really been liked much in Russia because of this sort of flip-flopping and not really being decisive, and just a whole bunch of other reasons. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. And of course, that situation then leads to really decisive action in Crimea. So this is what you were seeing in the news, right? So Crimea was obviously a very different kind of situation from anything else that happened in then Eastern Ukraine, because not just historically of it being, sort of a Russian-populated, Russian-controlled air peninsula, right, for several hundred years, and a place that has had that large, huge Russian population percentage-wise, right, dominant. I mean, obviously there's some other ethnicities there too, but also Crimea has had referenda in 1991, in 1994, and in each of those cases there was some iteration for, we want greater autonomy, we want dual citizenship, like 1994, this is what they were asking for, not just the Ukrainian citizenship, but also Russian. So you have that history there. But of course, most important, it was a place where the Russian army, right, the Russian Navy was stationed legally. So that was very, very different from what was going on in Donetsk, Lugansk, and Kharkov, and Odessa, et cetera, right? So go ahead.
May I intervene, dear? Just a personal question now, because I didn't know about this new data for me about this referenda in 91 and 94. So my personal question would be, for my knowledge, is Ukraine was not possible to have dual citizenship at that moment, or was just something like very specific for the region?
It was very specific for them. They wanted to be autonomous. They wanted to have much greater autonomy than any other part of Ukraine, like de facto Ukraine. The borders that Ukraine received as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was, of course, we talked about this many times. Those are not the borders that would have made sense, but those are the borders that it got. And instead of pursuing a policy of greater federalization and allowing people to have, their language, their culture, et cetera, eventually, the Ukrainian government doubled down and started pursuing this sort of minority identity from the West, right? Instead of looking at the overall situation and trying to actually work with everyone who lived in the country. But, it's what's done is done. So yes, they were, initially they were requesting greater autonomy. And then in 94, they also voted for having dual citizenship. Now, that just shows you precedence. If you actually go on the Wikipedia articles of those referenda, I'm sure now that I mentioned that someone is going to go and edit them and make them ridiculous, but they're actually not badly phrased articles. I mean, it does show you fairly legitimate information, and it is phrased in a fairly reasonable way. So yeah, so you had those two parts, right? You had the precedents in Crimea, and you had the legal stationing of the Russian Navy, right? The Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. So you kind of had that, which was very, very different from what was going on in the rest of southeastern Ukraine. So, you know, this is why we talked about Crimea being annexed, or, you know, I like to say it's sort of rejoined its home.
No, it was invaded.
It was invaded without a single shot. And I mean, there was so much documentary information from that period that it's really kind of hard to argue with, despite all the Western media coverage. And of course, you know, if you think about this jewel of the Black Sea, right, for NATO, this would have been just like candy. Like, this is what they wanted. They would have had this permanent, with the Maidan, this permanent point of, you know, permanent stationing point in the Black Sea, right next to Russia. That would have been the biggest FU. That would have been a huge geopolitical win, but they lost, right? Because in that one situation, the Russian government, which it's sort of like slept through the Maidan, right? It was also happening during the Sochi Olympics, which is, of course, you know, why the timing is not coincidental, because Russia was distracted. But it seems like it was distracted for a couple of decades, considering what was going on with, you know, the other types of meddling coming from the official West in Ukraine. But be that as it may. So that was very, very decisive, right? Just acting very quickly, having this 2014 referendum, right, which, again, was completely in line with the 90s referendum. So it's really kind of hard to say that this was staged and it was fake when there are multiple precedents. And there are other sort of political decisions that have been made between 94 and 2014, where you can say, okay, these people are actually pretty consistent in their wishes. So it's kind of hard to claim that, you know, Russia invaded Crimea when you have all those precedents as well. But because you had this annexation or rejoining of Russia, I think that really gave a lot of hope for sort of the southeastern Ukraine that Russia would do the same thing. But of course, the situation was very, very different. And so, yes, even as the Maidan was going on, there were sort of anti-Maidan protests going on in southeastern Ukraine. So Odessa, Kharkov, right, Donbass, right, Mariupol, which was, you know, that's kind of interesting because that's the one city that was in Donbass, but it got reclaimed by the Kiev government, whereas Donetsk and Lugansk did not. And so let's look at what happened in those cities. And Mariupol, when the battle for Mariupol was happening in 2022, people sort of went back to social media and they sort of reposted videos that we've all seen, or some of us have seen in 2014, having these tanks on the streets, just crushing protesters. I mean, very, very powerful sign. In Odessa, we had the massacre, right, on May 2nd, with the trade union building where dozens of, you know, peaceful protesters died in horrible ways. They didn't all die from smoke inhalation. Some of them were physically taken out. You know, it's too graphic to mention on this channel, but you can probably go and find out what happened. And the numbers, I mean, the official numbers are sort of a few dozen, but there's also like this sort of tinfoil hat type of conspiracy theory that it might have been more than 100, which, you know, could be plausible. So having that kind of a nightmare happen in a very historically, Odessa is a very multicultural city, right? But it's also very culturally Russian, Russophone. To have that nightmare happen to people who are peacefully protesting, I mean, that was a powerful sign. And really nothing happened to the perpetrators in the grand scheme of things. And that was a very powerful message. If you go and you continue your little anti-Maidan protest, very bad things can happen to you. So this is just one of the reasons, right? So Crimea, the Russian government acting very differently, obviously being able to act upon Crimea and not being able to act upon sort of southeastern Ukraine, but also the massive crushing of these protests that was happening violently by, you know, the Kiev government. So that was huge. But also, I would say in Donbass, things were happening a little bit earlier. And the pro-Russian separatists, right, I'm using big air quotes, ended up capturing the city administrations, et cetera, a little bit earlier. in some ways, and they basically had greater control of some of those areas as well. So, I would say it's a complex question, but those would be some of the reasons why the protests were crushed in Kharkov, Odessa, et cetera, but it sort of the resistance managed to survive in Donetsk, Lugansk, in those regions. And of course, 2014 was a very decisive year because parts of the initially resisting cities like Mariupol, like Slavyansk, have been recaptured by Kiev. And they're still, Mariupol has been liberated, in my opinion, for YouTube, it's in my opinion. Well, they say it's been, it's been captured by Russians. In my opinion, it's been liberated by Russians, and it's where it belongs. But yeah, we'll leave that there. But yeah, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, they're still being controlled by Kiev. And I guess that was very naive in 2022. I thought it was those two would be recaptured really quickly. But that seems to be sort of the most difficult part, right? Because Kiev had 8 years, right, between 2014 to 2022 to dig itself into trenches, World War I/World War II style trenches, where those battles took place as well. Again, that sort of historical, the land remembers, right? The soil remembers being dug for those other world wars. And here here's another conflict. It's been pumped full of weapons by NATO countries. Even before it started being pumped full of weapons, some of these people coming from the extreme nationals battalions would go to, let's say, or would be trained by, let's say, Canadians very, very publicly. So that explains why Donbass hasn't been fully recaptured and why it's been such a bloody battle to liberate it sort of town by town, village by village. But yeah, officially, Donetsk Republic, right, the self-proclaimed republic, declared independence on, I think, April 7th, 2014, and Lugansk declared it sort of towards the end of the month. So there was a little bit of that period. And at the same time, the interim government, the post-Maidan government, which was led by Alexander Turchinov, whose nickname was the Bloody Pastor. I still think he's the Bloody Pastor. He's the one that launched the so-called anti-terrorist operation, which was basically meant to crush this unrest in the Donbass republics. In the CNN article I read to you was part of that anti-terrorist operation. So technically, Kiev, the official Kiev, perceived this land and these people as their own. And at the same time, they're not just shelling them, they're also striking them from the air, from their Su airplanes, right? So this was just a very shocking escalation from February to June of that year.
So if I may express my very ignorant opinion from what I've been learning in these 2 years of the way Russia worked during the Maidan, after the Maidan. I think there has been always a try or a hope maybe to end this situation in the less warful way, in the most peaceful way. I mean, let's try diplomacy. There has been some shows of force. There's this reports that said that the Nord Stream deal was put out in the moment where Russia had a bunch of NATO troops encircled during the Crimea invasion. I will use super quotes here. And also, I mean, there was always a quote that Gonzalo Lira, may God have him, or whatever, wherever he's feeling happier, that he always says, you only go to war with what you have. And maybe, we have to remember that just a couple of decades ago, before that, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and then Russia has been, robbed and stealed by everyone for about 10 years. And that's just 10 years apart from, 2001 to 2014. Well, 14 years, sorry.
I mean, and the Second Chechen War officially ended in 2009. So it was very, very
plus
recent
two Chechen
in the
wars
right.
and Georgia and all that. So, I mean, I don't think they had what they needed to have what they had now.
Yeah, well, of course, this
2022.
is sort of the argument, right? On the one hand, in 2014, even though Ukraine likely had Western intelligence agencies operating there, you know, especially after the regime change, likely, right? We're sort of making funny comments here. And it's sort of transferred its control to, you know, the West-backed establishment. It wasn't pumped full of weapons, right? So the main argument is that Russia would have had a much easier time intervening in 2014 because it did not have to deal with a NATO-trained army. It did not have to deal with an army that's been, you know, digging itself in all around Donbass, right, for 8 years, 2014 to 2022. It didn't have the NATO weapons, right? So it kind of lost this valuable time. The counter argument is that, like you're saying, Russia was simply not ready in terms of being able to face this barrage of sanctions. Now, Russia was sanctioned pretty heavily with Crimea, but it was not sanctioned to the extent that it was sanctioned in 2022 till now. I mean, I think it's broken multiple records about being the most sanctioned country in the world. I think the last number I saw was maybe 13,000, but then there's another package since then, so I don't even know what that number is. Now, some of those sanctions are, of course, personal sanctions about specific government officials, and sometimes it's like about some, you know, sports figure, just completely meaningless. They're just sanctioning for the sake of sanctioning. But some of those are economic sanctions, and of course they could be serious. Had Russia not sort of played its cards right with the Russian central bank, had Russia not used its, you know, vast natural resources to kind of turn the situation around, which is, you know, it's a separate topic. But yeah, this is one of those things that there were multiple cases where the Kiev missiles, well, maybe not missiles, but maybe shells, hit across the official Russian border, internationally recognized Belgrade, which, you know, in today's day and age, Belgrade has been essentially a besieged city, taking on a lot of the onslaught. So, you know, Donbass has been shelled, right, for a very long time. And Belgrade, a Russian city, right, the borderland city, became kind of one of those places too. So anytime there was sort of this crossing the border, I naively thought that Russia would retaliate, thinking, well, now you're being shot across the border, like this is a, you know, casus belli, like what are you doing? And nothing happened. So you know, this is one of the reasons why I was surprised in 2022 that Putin decided to launch this, you know, escalated special military operation, as he calls it, because there's been so many other cases where he thought, okay, well, this is too much. This is now too much. They're not just killing civilians of Donbass in the, you know, in the thousands, but they're also shooting across the border. Like, this is, come on, do something, and nothing happened. So yeah, I mean, I guess there was that. Possibly. I mean, it seems like there was that sense of preparation, perhaps, for the worst. At the same time, I don't think it was preparation in the way that we've heard from, you know, Merkel, from Hollande, and from Poroshenko saying, oh yeah, the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015 were just to buy time for us to arm and train Ukraine. I think there must have been some kind of hope that this would be a de-escalatory measure. Now, of course, for many of us, it seemed to be very defeatist. It was not something that, I mean, we understood the idea of this is a peace settlement. It's going to be imperfect. When you have that kind of negotiation, neither side is going to get what they want. And maybe having peace is better than living in this constant state of war, where even if people are not being killed, because eventually there was a de-escalation. The first 2 years were a nightmare, right? If you looked at those statistics, it was like 14,000 dead on both sides, and like 50,000 injured. And then there was sort of the numbers sort of started going down. And partially you could say maybe because of the Minsk agreements, but at the same time, they would have their infrastructure, right? Like water supply damaged. Those types of things that make you function on a basic level in a society, you know, like heating and stuff. So that was also happening. And of course, by then the media sort of lost interest in the West in terms of covering it, because you no longer had these bloody scenes on a daily basis with, you know, dozens of people injured, like the CNN article that we read at the beginning of this episode. So Yeah, I think we're thinking of it at the same time, but one of the sort of the main points of the Minsk agreements was to reintegrate Donbass into Ukraine. And just the idea of reintegrating Donbass with its cultural roots, with its ideology, into a state that is openly hostile to it was like, this is not, like, it cannot happen. Like, these people are going to get slaughtered after the reintegration. These people are going to get ethnically cleansed after the reintegration as described by the Minsk agreements, right? So many of us were very disappointed by that. And so we kind of had very conflicting feelings about it. Like, on the one hand, technically, this is supposed to de-escalate. On the other hand, in the long term, this is going to be like the death of Donbass. They're going to ethnically cleanse it. They're going to repopulate it by ideologically pure people, according to the, the Kiev regime. And that's going to be that. So, it was just one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situations, unless you fully intervene. But then you can't intervene because, you're going to be economically, there's going to be economic warfare, right? The type of economic warfare that we've seen since 2022. So yeah, this is one of those difficult questions that, hindsight, I don't even know if hindsight is 2020, because I still can't answer whether it would have been better for Russia to intervene then. And if you also look at just the general functioning of, the official West in Russia, no one really wants to really significantly damage the standard of living. Like, NATO would send mercenaries, but it doesn't really want to send its troops, right? Russia, of course, it has a huge army involved, but at the same time, people in its cities are not like living like in World War II, right? So people who are not involved in that conflict directly, excluding, sadly, the borderland cities, are living normally. And I feel like in the West and in Russia, there is this feeling like we still want to continue as this. We want to maintain normalcy. And at the same time, we have this insane war, right, between sort of the two geographically, right, between NATO land and Russia, which is, that's sort of another question. So perhaps in 2014, the Russian government knew that had it gotten involved, it would have been living in, the standard of living would have been just gone, right? So, I mean, it sounds kind of callous from that perspective, but that's kind of how I read it. And of course, go ahead.
I see. Well, I don't see. Of course, I imagine that the leadership in Russia, unlike the Western leadership, they really understood all the constraints, all the possible. So as you mentioned, the economic warfare, the media warfare, the population itself. I mean, you have to tune up the heat on the country so people get to the war mind,
right?
The mindset for going to war, to accepting war. Otherwise, people take down the government. That's not interesting either.
Exactly.
So I think there's a lot of constraints in this matter that they had to. I don't buy it. Like when the Putin said that, oh, I'm disappointed with the Western powers. They fooled me for so many years. I don't buy that. The guy knew what was going on,
right?
And I don't buy what Merkel said as well. That we were doing this for that. No. You had the problem. You had issues, and you tried to work it in.
Yeah, of course, the alternative interpretation is that in the new world order after, February 2022, she was just trying to cover her butt, right? Basically saying, no, we weren't cooperating with Russia at all.
Yeah,
we were trying to arm Kiev. Yeah, so there's definitely that alternative interpretation too. And I feel like the jury is still out on the question. Yes, Putin gets, it's like the arming of Ukraine was happening in the open. It wasn't going on like, not that Putin doesn't have access to secret intelligence, but the fact that it was happening very, very brazenly, it was like, how can you not
understand?
Yeah, where this was leading. Yeah,
so there's definitely. I really think they tuned it until it was impossible to tuning it and say, okay, we have to do something now because, well, we had the G7, if I'm not mistaken, or the G20 just before in November, just before 2022, November 2021, where, you know, everybody was very excited and Zelensky was, you know, saying all these things. Oh, we need nuclear weapons. And
Of course.
the framework. So the Russia came down with the new security framework. This is what we want. This is what we need.
It was
Please
very
consider.
reasonable. It was a very reasonable,
Quite reasonable, by the
agreement.
way.
Yeah.
Yes. So just considering what you just explained about the Luhansk and Donetsk. There was a question here from R.W. Emerson. Do you mind if we read questions? Was there any desire?
I mean, I think there's a point to be live, right? If we're live, we can actually answer questions live, right? As opposed to releasing a recording, then we're going in the comments. Yeah, for sure.
This interaction is always very interesting. Was there any desire in the DPR and LPR to remain independent of Russia? I mean, we will get independence from Ukraine, but we not exactly want to join Russia. We just want to, you know,
I would say there were some elements that were ideologically left-wing, more socialist, that wanted to be sort of build their own, you know, with having the history of the USSR and then seeing that Russia is sort of this quasi-liberal capitalist state, right? Definitely not a socialist state. There were definitely some elements that were more ideological that perhaps wanted to maintain. But I would say overall, the population there kept hoping that Russia would intervene and like physically intervene and not just send, you know, humanitarian aid or have these volunteers come and fight, but actually intervene the way it did, right, in 2022. And I think for the majority of the population, the wish was to reconnect, excluding these more, let's say, more ideologically like socialist elements. So I don't want to completely discount them wanting to build this, you know, this their own thing. Maybe some of them wanted to have more autonomy with, let's say, if they were to rejoin Russia. But overall, I would say the overall sentiment was to reconnect, excluding these elements. But the other thing that I wanted to do is sort of to go back and read a couple more headlines. Some of them are coming from what I mentioned to you, from major human rights organizations that cannot be accused of being pro-Russian. So here's one from September 8th, 2014, right? So it's within 6 months of the conflict becoming very violent. Quote, the headline is, Ukraine must stop ongoing abuses and war crimes by pro-Ukrainian volunteer forces, right? Very, very clear who is doing the war criming here, right? Here is another one from the Human Rights Watch, also in 2014. This is a quote. This is not the headline, but it talks about, quote, Ukrainian government forces and pro-government militias have killed at least 16 civilians and wounded many more in insurgent control areas, blah, 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 blah. Talking about, quote, the use of indiscriminate rockets in populated areas violates international humanitarian law or the laws of war and may amount to war crimes, end quote. So again, this is the narrative that we've had since 2022. It's like it completely erased these supposedly independent reports, definitely not coming from the Russian side, about war crime after war crime committed by the West backed Kiev forces. Here is another one. This was 4 years into the conflict, and it is coming from the United Nations. Ukraine, so 2018, Ukraine, 4 years of conflict leave 4.4 million people in dire need of humanitarian assistance, right? So this includes refugees, this includes people in Donbass. So again, this is sort of like this international body telling you that the conflict is awful. You even had quotes coming from the Atlantic Council, which is like a NATO-linked think tank, saying Ukraine, quote, got a real problem with far-right violence. And no, RT didn't write this headline, end quote, right? That's very, very clear. A NATO-linked think tank is sort of going after Ukraine here. Now, I'm gonna go, here's another one, Atlantic Council. Ukraine should do more to combat human trafficking. So all of the things that we heard about recently in the last 2 years were going on in relation to Donbass. And you have these either completely pro-Western sources or nominally independent sources, human rights organizations, squarely, pointing the finger in Ukraine. Now, this one is very interesting. It's coming from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, right? This is a U.S. government state-funded media source that was initially launched to combat the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union media information. This one is from 2016, I believe, and it's about one of those paramilitary battalions called Tornado, and they're calling them territorial defense battalions. So, quote, "It's a house of horrors," an elderly woman calls out admonishingly to the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty reporter photographing it under a gray sky as she shuffles to the nearby bus stop. Ukrainian military prosecutors, police, and residents allege that members of the Tornado Battalion tasked with policing Provilia and nearby communities went rogue, committing violent crimes against at least 13 civilians. So multiply that in your mind, right? This is the official numbers. Of people who came forward in the first half of 2015. The list of accusations includes RAPE and torture, kidnapping, illegal imprisonment, extortion, robbery, and creating a criminal gang. And then it goes on. So this is a media source funded by the American government, right? And they're telling you this is how awful these battalions that are crushing the rebellion, the resistance in Donbass are. Like it's a nightmare.
Just to mention that you read that title about Ukraine having to take care of human traffic. It seems just today I saw it on Twitter somewhere, news that in Germany the police found about 150 children. Ukrainian children, well, not they just found among people. I don't know. Right. I didn't. There's no detail about human trafficking. But these 150 children were among the list of children that were supposed kidnapped by Russia.
Oh God! Of course, it's amazing.
Why not?
Right. Yeah, and so I haven't seen that headline, and that just tells you a lot because the whole kidnapped by Russia was, pumped by multiple sources, even after it's been debunked of, well, we actually evacuated these people and they're welcome to go back if they want to, or their families can rejoin them. So yeah, I haven't seen this particular headline, but that's another unfortunate validation coming, way too late. So yeah, it's kind of amazing that you have this record coming from these non-Russian sources that in no shape or form, right? A NATO-linked think tank, U.S. government-funded media source, right? And it's just amazing that it's all out there. So the sort of this trend, especially on social media amongst these accounts that are meant to, to harass you or to crush any kind of disagreement from the official party line, is that the Donbass situation never happened. And yet there is this extensive record that is, still up there. It's still accessible. And this is also before they started spelling Kiev with a Y and all this other linguistic garbage that had been introduced in the Western media, the official Western media echo chamber since the last couple of years. Yeah. So for those of us who've been sort of following it in real time, it's pretty interesting the way things that just got erased, even though they're still up. I mean, I guess because maybe your average news consumer, like you said, like you always say, they're too busy with their daily life they wouldn't even know how to search for this information, right? And one of the conspiracy theories is that they changed Kiev to Kiev with a Y because it's now harder to search for articles that would mention Kiev with an I, right? And you would kind of come across some of these. I mean, it might be just a conspiracy theory, but you certainly would have to know how to find it to be able to get this kind of information.
Yeah,
Are you looking at another question?
I was actually searching for the headline about Germany, and for those who are watching us on Twitter, on the Imprensa Idem TV Twitter, something went wrong with the title, and it reposted the same title as the episode 9 about Yugoslavia,
Strange.
and I have marked Neboja Malic. So he
Oh.
wrote me a message.
Oops. I think it's when you
are we
use
supposed to go live or something? And so Neboja, I'm sorry, I did something wrong.
Yeah, no, I think it's I think it happens when you reuse settings and it just gives you the previous setting, and sometimes it's not so easy to change the basic things like the thumbnail and the title. I don't know why it happens, but I've had that happen on YouTube where I would change it and it would still be previewing the previous one that was used as a template. So yes, we apologize for
especially to Neboja. I'm sorry, dude.
Especially.
Hope to have you back in the channel.
Yes, I'm sure he'll be back. This is a sign that we have to invite him back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's
so now
that's
that you're
Rumble telling me that.
Yeah, Rumble is telling you that. So now that you're listening to me read out headlines coming from non-Russian sources, definitely very biased, pro-Western, pro-official West, or funded right by their governments. What is your impression?
Well, again, it's always very difficult for me to give a oh my God, my impression, how is that? Because I've been pumping myself with some little bit of knowledge during this period, and as you mentioned, a lot of headlines from Western media. I will mention when I start searching for this, you can search on YouTube and you go BBC neo mustachists, and you're gonna see at least once a year there was a TV documentary from BBC talking about the escalation of neo-mustaches from 2014, 2015 onwards until 2022, February 2022, when, suddenly
all of a sudden they disappeared.
There is no one on that ideology in Ukraine. It's absolutely no one. No.
Well, it's interesting
those
because
symbols is because they are Vikings and because they are Celtics, whatever. No
Celtic Ukrainians.
Yeah,
Celtic
exactly.
Ukrainians, yeah. So, well, that would kind of go along with some of this historic rewriting about, having roots 5,000 years ago with some of these ancient people that apparently all came from Ukraine, which was seen as well. They built the
pyramids, all that.
Yeah, they dug the Black Sea. Yeah, so we've certainly seen that. But no, that's like one of the memes is that they dug the Black Sea. Well, because you have a bunch of, initially it was sort of these, maybe every country has these, marginal historians that like to go back and link you to some important historical people or event from 10,000 years ago. We're the original source, right? Everyone came from us. But it kind of escalated with, when you're sort of getting rid of your actual history, you have to replace it with something, right? There's a vacuum. So that sort of marginal history, not fully, but it definitely became more prominent with these really insane theories of links to, to like Buddha, to Egypt, to Herodotus, just real craziness.
China Wall, whatever.
Yeah, quite possibly the Great Wall of China too. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's in the Maidan, right? They use these. I don't know. The term far right kind of doesn't really encapsulate it. I just call them ultra nationalist, and they have sort of different variations of different ideologies. But many of them definitely sort of worship the World War II Banda right type of mentality. And those were sort of like the enforcers on the streets, right, of the Maidan regime. But of course, after the regime, these people are sort of in power on the streets. So how can you get rid of them? Because they can go after you. So this was sort of like the thing that was very beneficial, like any kind of freedom fighters, right? In Syria, let's say, But after this regime change had been successfully carried out, you kind of don't want them there anymore, but they're still there because they can go, they can go after you. So, I mean, again, one of those tinfoil conspiracy theory hats is that Zelensky, in addition to being, possibly money hungry, et cetera, just being super opportunistic, that he's also afraid of these street elements that can go and take him out because they've really been giving a carte blanche in terms of what they can do, sort of, kind of like gangs basically operating would be the rough equivalent. So yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, exactly. So, but of course, more ideological, right? Not just seeking money, power, or whatever else, having that ideological foundation. Yeah. So it's very, that's also very interesting. Possibly that's part of it. Although I think Zelensky has bigger problems than these sort of, ultra nationalist street gangs going after him because he's, entirely controlled by outside sources in my opinion. So there are other things going on, but that could be part of the puzzle. Certainly the same thing was said about Poroshenko, the first sort of official elected Ukrainian president after the Maidan, that he possibly could have gone after these ultra-nationalist gangs, again, quote unquote, but didn't because he was afraid that they would, go after him or his people or someone linked to him. So that certainly is part of the puzzle here too. But yeah, you went to 2021 to talk about the, that international meeting, and that is when the escalation in Donbass started happening, right? There was sort of like, I don't want to say complete lull because just because there are not like dozens of people dying, but it's like a couple people here and there, and dozens are being blown up on landmines, right? It doesn't mean that nothing is happening there. Like their water supply is being repeatedly taken out, but there was certainly the death toll did decrease. Like if you look at those UN statistics, the first year was massive, and then it sort of started going down. But
there's actually there's actually a report. If you check the reports from the Human Rights Watch, the department that was responsible to make sure that the Minsk agreements were being followed. OSCE, exactly. Yeah. So you can actually see during these months of January and February, highly increasing of.
It was going from here and it was just going up. Yeah.
Exactly, of peppering from Ukraine on
around the demarcation line. Yeah, that was definitely one of the signs. It's kind of like you were saying that Putin waited until he could no longer wait, and I think that was an indication that there's this, again, relative lull compared to 2014, 2015, when the Minsk agreements were implemented. And all of a sudden, the demarcation line is just being, shelled repeatedly. And so the numbers, like you're saying, even the ones that are being tracked by very imperfect organization like OSCE, all of a sudden they go up. And on the topic of OSCE,
they call it violations. I was searching for the word. Violation
of the Minsk agreement, of the peace regime, right? There are different terms that they've used for it. So yeah, it's definitely quantifiably documented, right? Between late 2021 and the launch of the special military operation in 2022, there is this massive escalation. So as you're watching this unfold, the question, again, it's done in public. It's not like some clandestine thing that's going on behind the scenes that people don't know is happening. It's like, it's very, very obvious. So the question is, where is this going to lead? You have the official Western leadership basically rejecting every possible reasonable agreement in terms of having peace on the continent of Eurasia, right? Especially in sort of this part of Eastern Europe, and then all of a sudden you have this increased shooting up of the breakaway republics. So the obvious question is like, where is this going to go, right? They're either going to be invaded by Kiev and just run over, Hitler, like Blitzkrieg style, right? Or there has to be some kind of a response. So, again, I was surprised that there was a response, even knowing these numbers, because there hasn't been in so long, and you kind of got complacent thinking like, these people are just going to have this awful life being in the borderlands, right? Neither here nor there. And obviously, I was proven wrong in that regard, that something did have to happen. But again, I think it's a matter of not, we talked about this before, not so much of what should happen, but when it should happen. I mean, there has to be, the time element has to be like enough of a catalyst for some kind of decisive action to take place. But yeah, I mean, obviously, February 2022 was very, very surreal, right? And of course, this is when that decision to legally incorporate the breakaway republics into Russia took place. And now, obviously, I realize that it's not internationally recognized by most countries because it's not in their interest to go against the international rules-based order. Whereas, of course, when it comes to something like Kosovo, we're going to have a very different perception of that. So of course, it's not even worth discussing the hypocritical actions here versus actions there when it comes to the rules-based order. But yeah, so technically these republics, so this is kind of weird when we talk about Belgorod, which is like a borderline Russian city, and it's within the officially recognized federal borders of Russia. But technically, we also have these extra territories that were reincorporated into Russia, in my opinion, reincorporated, in the opinion of the official West conquered, blah, blah, blah. Who cares? And
as you wish, now it's Russia's.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, as part of that special military operation, parts of other regions, right, not fully, were added to, like parts of the Kherson region, for instance, were added to what Russia considered its territory. So I think in that time frame, I'm sure the residents of Donbass were also very hopeful that they're now not going to be shelled. And of course, the opposite happened. Kiev has engaged in essentially terror bombing campaigns of the region, selecting like the absolute, best for terror bombing, but the absolute worst for civilians, right? Selecting weekend days, selecting like large markets, and very obviously civilian targets, like nothing to do with the army. And this was when it would strike. And of course, you have these critics saying, well, why hasn't Russia used air defenses? But it's like, dude, they're being shelled. Like, what are you going to defend in the air if someone is being shelled? And so one of the goals, right, which has taken a long time, longer than many of us had hoped, was to push the border of these republics far enough so that Kiev would not be able to reach these tormented cities, right, by using these types of weapons. And it's taken a long time. And so far, I guess in some ways the situation has improved, but it certainly hasn't been resolved to any definitive extent. So this is sort of, I would say, one of the immediate goals of what's been going on. So even though technically, according to Russia, right, to the Russian government, those republics that have been resisting for so long got what they wanted, what most of the people there wanted, it didn't really solve the issues that they were facing. And in some ways, things got worse in terms of the punishment, right, coming from their former country that's supposed to have considered them their own citizens, right? So, yeah exactly.
So, if you would like, I would read one question that I enjoyed. Well, a comment, and then a comment that I really enjoy, and then a question, and then I think we can wrap it up. So the Peter Pan said, information was rampant. We in the West are like mushrooms, kept in the dark and poop thrown at us for sustenance. Yeah, that's it.
For sustenance,
We're mushrooms. And from R.W. Emerson II, we have a royalty person here. What if Russia had delugged the DPR and LPR with humanitarian aid and development, make Donetsk showcase like Mariupol today? That's a very interesting question. It's a question that a friend of mine always asks when he asks about why didn't Russia play the same game, of intervention?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, Mariupol was recaptured by Kiev, right, in 2014, and Donetsk was part of the basically the breakaway republic. So obviously there is that very different. I don't see you anymore.
No, it's okay. I have to restart my camera.
Oh, I see. Okay, very good. You can still hear me. Yeah. So there's obviously that difference, but there's been smaller attempts to rebuild Donetsk where possible. So, for instance, remember Kiev kept cutting off water supply not just to Crimea but also to Donbass. So one of the things that they had been doing is basically establishing its own independent water supplies, so that the Donetsk region, the Donetsk Oblast, would no longer have to depend on sort of outside sources for water. They've certainly rebuilt some sort of smaller things like schools and buildings, but obviously, if you're living under constant shelling, it's a little bit more difficult to do what they've done in Mariupol. Well, what is your take on it? This is certainly something that's been covered in Russian media. I don't think it makes it to the Western media. Sort of these smaller rebuilding projects in Donetsk and the Donetsk region. And I don't know if I could hear you anymore. Let me.
Do you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, sorry, I can hear you. Perfect.
Am I back?
Well, what do you think they should have done? I mean, it's just one of these things that I think any solution would be imperfect.
Yeah, that's exactly. Well, as I said, this is a question that my friend always asks me. I mean, so the West was, meddling inside Ukraine. Why wasn't Russia playing the same game?
Well, I mean, I think the Western argument that Russia was playing the same game, but perhaps it wasn't playing the same game at the level that the West was playing, right? So this is sort of the argument.
So it's a very hard question. What could be done? And I think your answer is perfect to that. How can we decide? So let's say, okay, they pump aid into the Donetsk and Luhansk region. That's okay. But what about the rest of Ukraine? I mean, the western part of Ukraine. What about the ultranationalists? What about it's very hard to shape perception with just a couple of good things. It's much easier to shape perception with a bunch of ultranationalists that just go around breaking everything.
There's also this idea of the West was simply, it had more money and it was better in terms of establishing these NGOs, right? Pumping a lot of money into the media that it itself established, and then this media would disseminate the points of view that it wanted. Russia was not doing that. Why wasn't Russia doing that? Is Russia not as good at using its soft power? Possibly, but at the same time, again, we go back into the situation that Russia was in, and it had other concerns, right? This is the reason it didn't intervene in Yugoslavia, right? The former Yugoslavia in 1999. Russia was still embroiled in the Second Chechen War until the end of the 2000s. So it had other concerns. Yes, in my opinion, it should have put in greater effort, and it would have had, in some ways, an easier time, in some ways a more difficult time in terms of fostering this. We have shared culture, shared language, et cetera, et cetera. But you need lots of money for that, right? I'm not really sure if Russia was in a position to do that. And yeah, there was also this myth of the West that I think by now has essentially been debunked. But for people living in those places, perhaps not traveling to the West and seeing it beyond, let's say, vacation, like what is it like to live in America, Canada, or Germany full time? Like, what are your taxes like? What is your safety like in Chicago, right? Like all these questions that you're not going to get from Hollywood movies or for any kind of propaganda coming from the European Union, right? So you have this myth of the West, and even if Russia, let's say, pumped money into fostering these, we have all this shared culture, blah, 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 would it have been enough? I'm not sure. When you have this sort of candy being dangled at you coming from the other side, and it's the type of candy that's been packaged for decades, right, through Hollywood film, through the media, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very, 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 very tasty forbidden fruit that's on that side. And I feel like even if Russia had done that, would have that been enough? I'm not sure.
That's the point, exactly, because it's not. I mean, the West did not pump money into aid and to make Ukraine better. They just bought a bunch of corrupt
opinion making.
Yeah.
Well, politicians, yes, politicians, but also opinion making. I mean, who is going to be the pundit on TV? Who is going to be setting the trends in terms of opinions? It's going to be the people that are coming from these NGOs.
And I think one point that's very important, that at that moment, we didn't know how to deal with social media.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Well, I still don't think we do know exactly how to deal with social media. But at that moment, I mean, if you look around the planet, we had 2016, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. You had the Arab Spring. You had the Euromaidan. You had the Syria crisis. I mean, all that is related to. Just recently, we had the Sri Lanka crisis related to social media.
Yes.
Because social media has always this face of being organic,
which
is not. Now we understand that it is not. We understand it. When I say we, I mean me, you, people that are watching us. But the vast majority of people still thinks that the WhatsApp guys, right? Or the Meta guys are just, the Uncle Joe that stays the day on Facebook posting BS. People still haven't figured out how this actually works.
Yeah, that it's not just this, like I said, when you first got on Twitter 10 years ago, it was like you're screaming into nothingness. And of course, like new accounts probably have the same experience. How do I get traction? So there's a reason why certain trends and keywords take off and certain accounts get amplified beyond any kind of, techniques that they've learned in terms of getting engagement and so on and so forth, right? So it's, there's definitely that element too. I think, it's the Arab Spring is a good example. I think it's the first mass campaign that was then really openly lauded in various Western publications, saying like, hey, look what we can do. We can manipulate opinion by having, after the fact, of course, right? We can do this by harnessing the power of social media and, essentially not always using real people, right? You can have stock accounts and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's definitely another element here. But it's interesting. Yesterday, I read a post by an MP in the Ukrainian Rada, right, the parliament, whose name escapes me right now, but he's from Zelensky's party. So he is definitely within the official narrative. And he wrote this long post essentially about how for him the myth of the West had died, which was, again, he was using some strange analogies. Like he went to Tolkien and he thought of Ukrainians as the elves, which is like, of course, Russians are the orcs, right? So generally, I'm not an expert on Tolkien, but aren't the orcs the industrialized elves? I mean, as far as I understand, I don't know that lore that well.
They're just the bad guys.
Well, right. I mean, in his mind, right. But I mean, in terms of the actual lore, aren't the orcs sort of the post-industrial elves, like the same kind of entities? I'm not sure. So correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, he was using that analogy and some other ones. So he basically said that at first we thought the West was this, this amazing place that was very, very idealized. Then we thought the West was going to be our friend. Then we thought the West was going to help us with weapons, right? Then we thought the West was more pragmatic. So he kind of denigrates it lower and lower between the perception of the West after the dissolution of the USSR to now. And then there's this kind of tragic realization of, the West was never our friend, that the West was never our equal, kind of all of the stuff that we've heard from our friend, a gynecologist Ursula, right, that Ukraine is another brilliant example of a European democracy. It's just a matter of time until it's in the EU and even possibly NATO, right? So all of those things. So it's very interesting to see a public Telegram channel with a big audience for a parliamentary who is in Zelensky's party, right? Posting with his little check mark from the official account. I almost thought about translating it. I don't know, maybe I'll, if I have the time, I might do it, because the Tolkien reference was really kind of like, really? This is what you're thinking? But yeah, basically he was just kind of going from this, impossible ideal to lower. Okay, the West is maybe just being practical. And finally, it's like, why did we even fall for any of this, right? Maybe it wasn't about us at all. Maybe this wasn't about helping us. Maybe this wasn't about, all the stuff that we thought it was about. So it was very interesting to see that realization again in a very public forum, right? It wasn't like, oh, Russia is great, which of course, if you're in Zelensky's party or in the official Kiev in general, you're not going to be saying that, or you're going to be dragged away by the SBU, SBU, let me put it in Russian. But yeah, it was very interesting that it seems to be this realization, especially with the situation with Israel and the extent, this is when Ukrainians started posting, wait a second, why are they helping Israel, but they're not helping us at all? What's the difference? We should sue them, which is, one of the kind of funnier things that I kept seeing on these viral posts in the Ukrainian language social media. But yeah, I think that realization after how many hundreds of thousands of people dead, right, is sort of slowly seems to be happening there. I'm not sure where it's going to lead. I mean, in my opinion, it would have been inevitable. I thought it would happen sooner, but seeing this is obviously better than nothing. And perhaps it took the situation in the Middle East for them to see the contrast, right? Beyond just being told, yeah, you're going to be getting these and those weapons, but you're not actually getting them. Where you're going to be getting NATO troops, but you're actually not getting them. Seeing the support for Israel versus seeing the relative lack of support. Obviously, Ukraine has been pumped full of money and weapons. God knows where most of that money went, but that's a separate question.
Not to Ukraine.
Promise you exactly. That. Not to the ordinary Ukrainians, for sure. Yeah, so this is very interesting, sort of debunking the myth of the West, which I think for a lot of people happened a lot earlier, but maybe not to people who are, maybe more idealistic, or it's kind of hard for me to put myself into their mindset. So yeah, so it was interesting to see from a public figure.
Yeah, the same thing as we were talking about Angela Merkel a couple of minutes ago. I think it applies for these people that you just mentioned. For example, Aristovich also has been very verbose about, oh, maybe we did something wrong. Maybe it was not such a good idea.
Well, in Russian, we have the expression of changing your boots right in the air, where you just do this complete 180. And I think he is one of those highly opportunistic people, because remember, before the war, he would go to Russia and he had connections to these Russian intellectuals. And then, of course, he was the spokesperson for Zelensky. And ever since he's been booted out, he's been criticizing. And almost, a lot of people say that maybe he is gearing for the post-war scenario where he has some kind of political power without having that baggage of being, right, a sort of unofficial part of the Zelensky cabinet, which could be true. But even if he is this insane opportunist, which I think he is, there's still some truth, right, to what he's saying. And, the criticisms like, oh, we're Russian after all is pretty interesting. I mean, there's this old joke there's kind of a joke going around where Ukrainian dies and goes to heaven, and he is really angry in God, and he asks God, like, why do Russians get everything? They have oil, they have natural resources, they have money, they have a certain standard of living, and you gave us Ukrainians nothing. This is so unfair. And God is that's not true. I gave you things. Like, when did you give us things? I gave you things when you're Russians. So back when you thought of yourselves as Russians. Yeah. So it's kind of, I don't want to say that the Ukrainian ethnicity doesn't exist, by the way, because there is that, in the western part of the country, that is certainly a separate ethnos, right? So that's a different story. But in terms of large parts of the country where some people sort of rebranded themselves as Ukrainians, but they were essentially Russophones, they were maybe ethnically mixed, or they're fully Russians, that certainly applies to them as well. So I feel like Arestovich is kind of like in that category. Even if he is a massively narcissistic opportunist, he's definitely sort of tuned in to perhaps the tides changing. And it doesn't negate what he is saying, even if his motivation for it is sort of personal opportunism and he's not a very, legitimate person in that sense. But I wouldn't be surprised if he survived like a cockroach and, came out on top in the new, in whatever happens in the new Ukraine post when this war is eventually over. Yeah, I think this might be a good point to end it. Me comparing Arestovich to a cockroach, please don't come after me. It's just my opinion.
Or maybe just get a good job somewhere in Europe or the United States. Who cares?
Which is kind of what's going to happen. Well, it's what happened to the initial Maidan government, right? It's what happened to a few of those functionaries that were in that interim government, right? They essentially went to get really nice, cushy jobs in the official West, right? So I wouldn't be surprised that this might be the trajectory as well. So,
well, yeah, I think we cover up mostly everything. Do you think we forgot something about this?
I'm sure we forgot something, but this is one of those topics. If we actually go into sort of more detailed breakdown of what happened in Donbass, like year by year, month by month, for instance, like the really high level assassinations of the leader of Donbass, like Zakharchenko, right? Some of these really famous military leaders. So that could keep us here for another 2 hours. So I think we're gonna leave it off here. Perhaps at some point we can come back to this topic, because they really kind of became these folk heroes, regardless of whether there were these perfect individuals or very deeply flawed individuals. They definitely gained this sort of folk hero status. So that was kind of an interesting side note to the lore of Donbass, is this sort of mecca of resistance, right? They having these folk heroes that had connections to folk heroes from like 1,000 years ago. But yeah, we can maybe talk about that at some point when we maybe make do an episode on some kind of symbolism in some kind of context. Yeah. So if you guys want to hear that, we can definitely. It doesn't have to be on Donbass in general, but we can talk about that idea in kind of maybe a more general framework. So yeah,
as usual, we already have requests for that.
Oh, okay.
R.W. Emerson II said, please do more of these.
Sure, we'll do more of this for sure.
For those that are watching, we're here every week mostly.
Mostly, yeah, and we'll invite poor Niboysha officially next time.
Yeah, not by mistake.
Rather than accidentally tagging him, yeah, we'll definitely have him back too, because things in the Balkans seem to be escalating. So it's certainly something that we can cover rather than going back in history. We can cover the modern developments, which, this could be another sort of front. Some people say, it's a nothing burger. Other people say, no, it's definitely escalating. So it would be interesting to hear from someone who's more of an expert than I am. But yeah, we can wrap it up here. Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you, all three of you. I'm just kidding. All one of you for watching. This was a good episode. Lots of ranting, lots of Winter Latina-ness.
A lot of participation from our audience, which is also very nice.
I think it's a good thing. Yeah, I mean, that's the point of going live, right? So you can actually address questions if they're popping up rather than doing a recording. Yeah, for sure. Thank you, guys.
Remember that if you like the show, leave a like. If you don't like, well, don't leave a like. Remember to, if you want to help finance the independent thinking, I will not call journalists because I don't consider myself a journalist. You also said that you don't consider yourself a journalist. So
I consider myself more of an analyst, but certainly sometimes I think we're doing things that are quasi-journalistic when we're, looking into certain questions and fact-checking. So there is that, maybe even more so than certain Western journalists who don't speak the languages that we do, right?
I was about to say that. I mean, if you consider that journalism, I better not be that.
I know, right? I better not be that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't want to be associated with that.
Remember to like, share, subscribe, and thank you, Nina. See you next time, next week.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Bye-bye.